So this is Unit 2, Module 1, Lesson 3, the else. There is a fast start activity and a startup code to download. Please do that now and pause the video. Else statements. We're going to talk about this today. However, I'm a little concerned with else statements because people have a tendency to use them as a crutch. Pardon the pun. They end up using these statements rather than thinking through a simpler logic. So I'm going to show you an example. If we want to check to see if someone's passing, the easy thing to do would be to say if grade is greater than or equal to 60, print out passing. But suppose we wanted to tell them if they weren't passing, if they were failing, as well as passing. Well, we discussed this for the practice exercises. One solution would be to start by saying string result equals failing. And if the grade is greater than or equal to 60, change the value of result to passing. Otherwise, leave result alone. And then print out result. So this has the benefit of allowing you to print out failing or passing with just an assignment statement. An assignment statement is less weighty or less memory intensive, so to speak, than a conditional test. So by doing this conditional test here, and using our string result equals failing in the beginning, this allows us to have two options to print out. Either say failing or say passing. So when you guys are designing your conditionals, I want you to think about it, do I actually need an else? As we start talking about else's, and I'll describe what they are, you'll see what I mean. But I want you to think about, do I really need to do this with an else statement, or can I do it in a more elegant fashion? Now when it comes to the AP test, get the answer. That's pretty much all it is. Your code doesn't have to be pretty for the AP test. It just has to work. Let me say it again. Your code does not have to be pretty for the AP test. It just has to work. So let's dive into the else. This is what an else structure looks like. And we say if grade is greater than or equal to 60, we're going to say passing, else we're going to say failing. But let's look at our brackets here. The first set of brackets is for this first condition. Then we use the word else, and then we use another set of brackets. So when you're doing an if-else and you're using brackets, there's two sets of brackets. However, we could have written this statement without any brackets at all. We could have just said if grade is greater than or equal to 60, system.out.println passing, because it's only a single line. Then we could have said else. Then we could have said system.out.println failing. And Java would have been okay with that. Typically, though, it's good coding practice for you guys, especially for using else statements, to use the brackets anyway. It could get very confusing if you don't. So for now, make sure you use the brackets. Always put the brackets first before you start writing any statements. So right away, write if, parenthesis, parenthesis, bracket, bracket, else, bracket, bracket. Put that all in before you start writing any code, and that way you won't forget it. Because I've seen many errors where students get very confused. In fact, I get very confused when I try to figure it out, where they have if statements and all types of different things going on, and they're missing this curly Q right here, next to the else. Visually, it's pretty challenging to find. So usually programs are going to need to test more than one condition at a time. It's not a simple single test. Simple ifs happen when the condition is true. To add an action when they are false, use an else statement. So there's a couple things we have to talk about here. First, how are we going to do this? How are we going to test more than one condition at a time? We're going to have to use some logic to do that, ands and ors. And then this else thing. Well, the else is usually the last thing, right? You can't say, if I go to the store and they don't have apples, then I'm going to buy bananas, else I'm going to buy apples, else I'm going to buy grapes, else. It doesn't make any sense. You can only have one else. You can only have one else. It can only happen one time. It's the last case. If everything else fails, do this. But we can have an else if. If grade is greater than or equal to 90, notice I dropped the curly brackets for this one because they're all single line statements, just so you know. I could put curly brackets in this, but to make it clearer in terms of the structure, I dropped all the curly brackets. Didn't need them. So if grade is greater than or equal to 90, print out A. Else if, check another condition. So this is not just an else, this is an else if, checking this condition. So pause the video if you're copying notes. So, to use an else if, we're adding an extra condition. Here's our original statement. If grade is greater than or equal to 90, we do this printing out of A. Then, if this is false, if grade is not greater than or equal to 90, which the opposite of that would be grade is less than 90, you need to think about that. When will this occur? So to think about that, you have to come up with the opposite of the inequality. Greater than or equal to 90 is when we are less than 90. So when we're less than 90, check to see if the grade is greater than or equal to 80. If that's not true, in other words, we're less than 80, check to see if the grade is greater than or equal to 70. If that's not true, means we're less than 70. Check to see if the grade is greater than or equal to 60. If that's not true, we must be less than 60, so print out F. This is a very well-written conditional. Notice it would not work if I started at the top with 60. The order of this is important. You can't do this by doing 60, 70, 80, 90. Because you could say it's greater than, but that doesn't quite work, does it? If it's greater than 90, then it's an A. Or if it's greater than 80, well, 90 is greater than 80. Right? That comes out as a true statement. It doesn't quite work that way. So the order in this was very important. Starting in a filtering out method. This is kind of like a sieve. Have you heard that phrase before? Where you start filtering out and the smaller pieces drop through? That's how a sieve has to work. You have to take out the bigger pieces, then do successive smaller grit until you get down to the finest, smallest pieces. You can't do the opposite. You can't start at the finest grit and then filter down to a bigger grit. That doesn't make any sense. So the order of this is extremely important for this to work. Typically, else-ifs are used as some type of sieve or some type of filtering out nature. These conditions should be in some way related. They don't have to be, though. You could be testing something totally different. Java will let you do that. You could say if grade is greater than or equal to 90, so when that's false, else if string is equal to happy, else if today's date is January 15th, else if whatever. So Java doesn't care what conditions you're testing. This is just stylistically, it makes sense if all the conditions are related when you're doing an else if structure. That's the purpose of this. If you're testing separate conditions, then maybe they should be separate if statements. So when you're combining if statements like this in this type of block structure where you're having one test and then fail, and then another test fail, and another test succeed, they should all be related. So, moving on. Take a look at this. There's a problem with this. This has to have curly brackets. Because what will happen is you're going to get a compiler error with this. If you put this code in as is, you're definitely getting a compiler error. Because what Java would do is say, all right, if A equals A, so compare X to A. If that's true, then GPA plus equals 4. End of if statement. This system.out.println top grade, yeah, it's just floating out there. Because this statement would execute whether this was true or false. This statement here is going to execute no matter what. Because it's outside the if statement. Then Java's going to execute this statement. Then it's going to get to here, else if. And it's going to give you the error, else without if. And you're going to say, wait, there is an if. It's here, and it's here. The if's there. What's Java doing? It's because it ended the if statement way back up here. So missing a curly bracket can really mess with your code. You won't know where the error is. Java doesn't quite understand it because it's going to end the if statement where it thinks it has to, up here. But really, the error started up here, and it's here, and it's here, and it's here, and here. So really, this is the way this code should look. We should have our curly bracket. I mean, you can put the curly bracket up here. That's fine, too. Surrounding our statements if there are multiple statements. So now Java says, okay, if X equals A, okay, that's false. Jump down to the else if. Skip everything in these curly brackets. Don't do it, because the condition's not true. If X equals B, then we're going to do this. If this was false, then it would just end and do nothing. Because I didn't put an else in. It would just stop. So, your try, you are to input a person's age. If the number is greater than or equal to 18, then they can vote. Otherwise, they cannot. Very timely. Please make sure you do this using an else statement. Don't do it the fancy way I showed you at the beginning of the video, the beginning of the lesson. Pause the video, do the U-try. So you are going to submit your U-try right here. Make sure you include the .java file when you submit it. So let's take a look at the solution. Pause the video if you haven't done the solution yet. I'm about to do it. So here's the solution. Very straightforward. No else needed. I used the curly brackets. You actually could have done this without the curly brackets around these statements. You could have just said, if age greater than 18, system.out.println vote, semicolon, else system.out.println no vote, and dropped all of the curly cues. Because they're just single lines. In fact, you could have just written this all one line straight across. Java doesn't care about white space. I've mentioned that before. We'll talk more about it later, but really Java does not care about any white space in the document at all. Well, that's not quite true. It doesn't like when you skip the space between like new and scanner. Like it wouldn't like that. But in terms of extra white space, it doesn't mind. Let's take a look at these. Will these all work? That's what we were just mentioning. Any problem with any of these? Take a minute and look at them. So the first one's fine. We don't need curly brackets here. The second one is really just a repeat of the first one, all taken up on the same line. Java does not require white space. Just said that. But it does require semicolons. It's missing the semicolon right here at the end of vote. So this statement will fail. It will not compile. You have to have the semicolons there. So Java's particular about brackets, curly brackets. Java's particular about semicolons, not particular about white space. One of the reasons why Java is not particular about white space has to do with its ability to be compiled and compressed in a very small, tight package. That was part of the point. You want to be able to compile this and remove all the white space so it compiles smaller. Otherwise, it has to interpret all of that white space. So this process is often used in web design. It's called minification. And you might see that if you look at the source code for some web pages, it looks like all the code was run together, and it was. They essentially took out all of the unnecessary white space. The white space is for you. The white space is purely there for you to make it easier to read. So this first statement here is fairly easy to read. It's fairly clear that we have our semicolons and we're not missing anything. This statement compared to this statement, it's challenging to miss this semicolon. It's challenging to see that that's the mistake. If you were missing a semicolon here, it'd be easier to see that you were missing a semicolon than it would be to see that you're missing the semicolon here. So the white space is purely for you to make it easier to read. Tabbing things in let us know what's supposed to be part of the if statement. If you had multiple statements here and you tabbed it in, that would mean it was supposed to be under the if statement. So if you're missing a curly bracket, that's where you would go and look. So now there is a practice assignment for you to do. There are 5 different things for you to work on. You can use else statements this time. So plan on using else ifs as appropriate. Don't use the elegant little technique I showed you in the beginning. This time I want you to concentrate on using else and else ifs. It's practice. So submit that into our practice assignment link, which I'll put up. I'm not sure why it's not there. I'll have to add that. So I'll add that. And then in the meantime, you guys can do the exit ticket. All right? So see you next time.